All right, guys, we are back for another podcast of Deals A to Z. And today we are going to be talking about seller financing. Now, seller financing is something that you need to definitely learn with where the market is going right now. And hey, I might as well just say it. Jeff's got a seller financing class actually coming up. So,
yes. So today we decided to recap our little section on seller finance deals, which is the last few episodes.
Yes.
Yoshi and I are just going to kind of chat and talk about some three sort of really basic keys to really kind of get to understand seller financing, kind of the three most important things, and then you can go from there and get more detailed.
Absolutely. And seller financing is something I think that's going to be very utilized by the individuals, investors who know how to utilize it. So you're going to definitely want to pay attention. So Jeff, let me ask you the first question, because there's lots of types of seller financing.
Right.
So I think the first question that one may want to ask themselves is, what kind of deal am I doing? Do you mind elaborating on that?
Yeah. And this comes from, when we say seller financing, it's a term of art that real estate investors use. And it's a broad swath of types of transactions. When we say seller financing, it can mean any number of different kinds of deals.
Yes.
So there are ways to partner with a seller. And in a partnering situation, it's like partnering with any other real estate investor. You might partner with the seller to do the fix up before they sell it and split profits. You might use a joint venture agreement. So that's a way of partnering. And because the seller is involved with you as the investor trying to make turn this into a profit deal,
yes.
That is seller financing. And I, in fact, it's one of my favorite ways to do flip projects is find a seller and partner with the seller. So I never buy the property.
Yeah.
It stays in the seller's name. The seller's mortgage stays in place. There's no due on sale clause issues. I do a joint venture agreement, maybe a note and deed to secure the money that I'm putting in. And then our joint venture kind of decides how we're going to split profits at the end. So in other words, I've just turned the seller into another investor and we partnered. And there's a lot of great things about that. And that's a type of seller financing transaction. The three main ways of seller financing really boil down to terms that I've kind of come up with these terms. Well, one of these terms. One is what we call traditional seller financing.
Okay.
Traditional seller financing is probably the tried and true, most common way of picking up seller financing deals. In a traditional seller financing situation, the seller does sell the house to the buyer, the investor, through a closing where title actually transfers and the buyer takes ownership in their LLC. Just like any other deal, just like picking up any other flip or any other rental, except the seller in some way helps finance all or part of the buyer's purchase price. So the seller in this case is going to become a bank. And the seller could become a bank simply by providing a note and deed. If the property is free and clear and there's no underlying mortgage, then the seller literally just does a mortgage like any other bank would do a mortgage. And the buyer pays the monthly mortgage payment to the seller.
Got it.
There are subject to deals where you buy properties subject to an underlying mortgage. And in that sense, where you're just taking over the seller's mortgage payment, the seller really is financing that, right? Because it is the seller's loan that he's sort of transferring to you. So when the seller when you take over the seller's payments on their mortgage, the seller's financing that amount to you to help purchase the house.
Right.
And then there's an all-inclusive note and deed or a wrap, and these are called wrap deals. And this is a situation where there's an underlying mortgage and there's another note and deed for a larger amount, larger than the underlying balance, that is owed to the seller. So in other words, the seller is going to collect on his note and deed, and from that money, then turn around and pay his underlying mortgage.
Right.
Okay. So those three situations, I call traditional seller financing because those are the three traditional ways to buy real estate, own it with help from the seller.
Got it.
Okay. So that's traditional seller financing. The second way is lease options.
Okay.
And a lot of people don't think of lease options as seller financing, but in fact, you're getting into a deal that's making you money with some help from the seller.
Yes.
In lease options, the seller does not sell the property, right? The seller stays the owner of the property. They become a landlord, and you, the investor, become a tenant. So you're going to sign a lease agreement. It's going to be a master lease agreement, which allows you to sublet it out. And you're going to get an option to buy the house at some future point in time.
Yep.
And then you're going to turn around and lease it out to your tenants, hopefully making some cash flow on the rent. You're going to assign the option to buy to your tenants too, if that's something they want. They don't have to, but if your tenants are looking to like a rent to own situation, you can assign the option to them. You can collect an option fee, and that's going to be bigger than the option fee you paid with the seller. So you might get some cash right up front. Right. And depending on the deal, you could sell it to your buyers at a higher price than the sellers are selling it to you.
Right.
So you might make more profit at the eventual sale when it sells a couple of years down the road. Right. So lease options are a great way to create both immediate cash flow, and future cash.
Yeah.
And you never own the property.
Yeah.
Right.
And if the market takes, you don't have to buy it.
Yeah, you don't have to buy it. There's no closing. There's no title companies, no closing costs. There's no loan fees. It's all a rental situation.
Yeah.
Okay. Now, at the end, when somebody does buy it, then of course that's a traditional sale.
Yes.
And it goes on. So the first one, traditional seller financing, the buyer actually takes title, owns the house, and makes some kind of mortgage payment to the seller.
Right.
In a lease option, the investor rents the house, right, and is paying rent to the seller.
Yep.
And then the third way is a contract for deed. A contract for deed is an installment contract, very similar to when you buy a car. And when you buy a car and there's a bank loan, the bank will actually hold title and own the car. And you make payments to the bank. And as soon as you're done making the final payment on that installment contract, the bank mails you the title to the car. And now you own it.
Mm-hmm.
Right. It's the reason why banks can just show up at your house and steal your car, take it away from you. They don't even have to talk to you. They can literally just pick up the car and drive off with it because the bank actually owns it.
Got it.
It's actually the bank's car.
Gotcha.
It's kind of a weird, so installment. And so a land contract or contract for deed is an installment contract for the purchase of the house. So it's a contract where the buyer does not take title now. So the seller still does own the house, but it's not a lease agreement, right? So the buyer is not a tenant, and you're not making lease payments. You're making payments on this contract, and when you make the last payment or whatever the terms of that contract are, at that point you get title to the house and the house is yours. So a contract for deed falls kind of in the middle, where a traditional seller finance is the buyer buys the house and just makes mortgage payment to the seller. Lease option is the buyer's a tenant, and it's a landlord-tenant relationship.
Yep.
And then contract for deed, it's a little bit like a landlord situation because the seller does maintain title and keep title. Yep. But at the same time, it's not a lease, and the buyer does have ownership in the house. It's not a legal title ownership, but it is an equitable ownership.
Got it.
And so there's some ownership rights, and it's a little bit like a lease. And so it kind of sits in the middle.
Gotcha.
Right. And in most states, very, very rarely does anybody use contract for deeds. There are a few states where it is the way to buy and sell real estate. Almost all their transactions are on contracts.
Interesting.
So, if you live in one of those states, great. There's a lot of information. Attorneys know what contracts for deed are. Courts know it. People know how to enforce it. People know how they work. In other places where people don't, they can be a bit intimidating and daunting, and they don't necessarily function all that well because there's just a lot of ambiguity about, is this a sale? Is it a lease? Where am I in this middle ground? So, but those are the three sort of common ways into seller financing: traditional, lease options, or contract for deed.
Wonderful. So I have to imagine there's different documentation for all three.
Yes.
What kind of documents does one need?
Yeah. So in a traditional seller financing, you're going to need a purchase contract, right? Because this is a sale. It's going to go to a title company or closing attorney, and title is going to transfer and all of that, just like any other deal. So you need a contract. I always recommend a seller financing specific purchase contract, not the generic 2-page one or not a state approved one. They just don't have the terms, especially if there's an underlying mortgage in place. If that underlying mortgage is going to stay in place for a while after closing, you've got issues like due on sale and other things we'll talk about in a second, that you really need good disclosures and what happens if clauses in your documents. So
Right.
if you're going to do a seller financing, I would invest in a good seller financing contract or good seller financing form.
Okay.
Because it just has additional language in it that you don't need in any other kind of transaction.
Gotcha.
And then you're going to need a note and deed or all-inclusive note and deed. These are loan documents, a mortgage document, if you will,
Yeah.
but some kind of document that evidences the loan that you're now paying to the seller, kind of thing. And then there's a few additional documents. So you might want to get a power of attorney or borrower's authorization letter, just in case you need to talk to the underlying mortgage bank. Remember, a bank's not going to talk to you unless you're the named borrower on that loan.
Right.
And so you'll need a power of attorney or some kind of authorization to speak to the bank.
Got it.
Okay. So
Gotcha.
that's traditional seller financing.
Okay.
In lease options, you're going to need what's called a master lease. This is just a lease agreement that allows the tenant to sublease.
Got it.
Because most of us in the rental world, and they just have our own rental properties, we rent out to our tenants, they're not master leases. We don't want our tenants subleasing ever, right?
Right.
So a tenant lease, one, forbids subleasing, whereas the master lease allows subleasing.
Got it.
So you'll sign a master lease with the seller so that you're a tenant, but you have the right to sublet.
Yes.
And then you need a regular lease agreement for your tenant.
Got it.
You'll need an option agreement to sign with the seller for the option to buy at some future point, and an assignment of option form, which allows you to assign that option to your tenant / buyers.
Gotcha.
Okay. And then a contract for deed, really the contract for deed itself is usually the only document because it's the one document that governs the whole thing. Just like when you buy a car, you sign one installment contract with the bank.
Yes.
It's one contract that governs the entire, sort of relationship between you and the seller. So it's a very much, it doesn't look like a purchase contract. There's parts of it that look like a purchase contract. There are parts of it that kind of look like a lease agreement. There are parts of it that look like mortgage or loan terms. So it is one that really is specific to the deal and should always be reviewed by an attorney. You should have sort of good legal counsel reviewing that, so you really understand what the terms are.
Got it. Got it.
And that's about it on the documents. There's some other things to help prevent things in the future, but those are the core documents you need to do either of those deals.
Wonderful. Okay, very cool. Now, the burning question, of course, when one decides to take these types of risks and investments, there's a lot of positives, but occasionally there are some negatives. What kind of issues might come up doing these creative financing transactions?
Yeah, well, the big one, I would say the big one that most investors are going to always bring up is the due on sale clause.
Okay.
I don't consider that the big one, to be honest. I really don't, because it doesn't happen that often.
Right.
It's very, very rare. Out of the millions of seller finance deals where these mortgages are staying in place, I mean, it's a handful that are called in.
Got it.
On the due on sale clause. And usually the bank finds out, usually because of some mistake the investor made or the seller.
Got it.
Maybe the seller just called up the bank or for some reason was talking to the bank and said, "Oh yeah, well I sold the property," right?
Yes.
When they weren't supposed to tell the bank that, or they change insurance. They change the named insured on the insurance policy, and the bank's going to get notified that there's a new insured, which means there's a new owner of the house.
Right.
And that might make the bank look into things. So, when it comes to the due on sale clause, there's two tips that I always give. The first is have an exit strategy, right? So plan out that, if in the event this loan does get called due, have an extra strategy where you can refinance it. You can maybe get a hard money loan. Maybe you can sell it retail. You can also make arrangements with the seller. Sometimes you can transfer title back to the seller and convert everything to a lease option.
Got it.
Or a lease agreement kind of thing, or a contract for deed at that point, and you'll have to create very unique documents in that situation, but that's a possibility because that's when the due on sale clause is called in, it's either pay off the bank or give the house back to the original borrower on the loan.
Got it.
Okay. So the first one is have an exit strategy. The second is do what you can to reduce the red flags. When I teach, there's a long list of things to do that you can, that if you take these steps, it's going to be much, much less likely that the bank will ever find out. and I've got clients that have had, hundreds of seller finance properties for 2 decades or more,
Right.
with no problems.
Yeah.
So, it's really rare. And I see the chat boards on all the different programs, and everyone's got their own opinion, and all these almost fear mongering about it.
Yeah.
And I just have never seen it in practice. I've never really seen it. You talk to old timers, like the investors that have been in this for 40, 50 years.
Yeah.
They don't even think about the do on sell. They just go, right?
Yeah.
They've got their exit strategy. So if it's call due, it's call due, no big deal.
Right.
Now, if you've got a local, like a smaller local bank or local credit union,
Yeah.
or maybe a local first-time home buyer assistance program. And most states have these programs where first-time home buyers can get a loan for the down payment, or even a loan to buy the house.
Yeah.
But they're local organizations that are going to be much more in tune with seeing the checks come in, the mortgage payment checks, and whose name is on them. And they may be more likely to check title. So those banks are definitely a little bit more risky, than Bank of America and Chase and all of those. The likelihood of them finding out is slim to none.
Got it. Okay.
So that's the due on sale clause. The bigger issue, I think, is your relationship with the seller.
Right.
Because all of these deals are partnerships in one way or another with the seller. The seller's going to be involved somehow until they're completely cashed out, until their underlying mortgage is paid off, or to their note and deed is paid off. You've got this relationship that might last 20 or even close to the 30 years, the term of the underlying mortgage. And, sellers disappear, they leave town, they die. Sellers might file for bankruptcy, right? Now think about that. If a seller files for bankruptcy and they've got an underlying mortgage, that mortgage bank is getting notice of the bankruptcy.
Right.
It's by default. It doesn't matter that the trustee in bankruptcy, when they process all this, the debtor has to list all of their assets and all their liabilities, and they're going to have to list that mortgage on the bankruptcy documents, and then the trustee sends notices to all those creditors.
Got it.
Doesn't mean that at that point they're going to see that it's taken over, but the trustee in bankruptcy is probably going to know. And so maintaining that relationship, I think, is really key. And I've always recommended doing either a post or pre-closing roundup. So either right before closing or at closing or just after, meet with the seller, sit down, make sure you've got good contact information, make sure you've got contact information of their children, maybe if they're older, or maybe they're maybe their attorney or their accountant, lots of ways to get in touch with these people. Tell them that it's really important that you stay in contact, right?
Yeah.
And not disappear, to answer the emails, so they really understand that, there's no real work on their part, but they do need to understand that they're still involved and you might need them for things. You can work with maybe them, helping them set up a family trust, right?
Yes.
Family trusts live forever. And then if they die, there's already a successor trustee that can come in and work with you.
Right.
So that roundup is just really, really kind of critical in the sense that, that's going to go a long way in solving a lot of future problems. And what I see investors doing is, finding a seller financing deal, especially like a subject to, where they're just taking over payments.
Yeah.
Right. It's like, hey, I'll just start making the underlying mortgage payment.
Yeah.
And boom, they're off and running. And then a year later, they're, something's happening and the sellers are gone. They can't get signatures. Or payoffs for the underlying mortgage. So maintaining that relationship with the seller is really, really critical.
Wonderful.
Yeah.
Wonderful.
And those are the two sort of biggest that we talk about and I think, by reducing red flags on the due on sale and keeping in contact with the sellers, you can resolve most anything, even if there's a fire and the underlying, you're using the seller's insurance, which is, we don't recommend, we always recommend getting your own on top of the one that's already in place with the bank.
Right. Yeah.
But if you've got that relationship, you can solve the problems as long as, almost any other problem, if you have that relationship and contact.
Wonderful. Great. Excellent. Very, very useful information. I really liked how you say, get a hold of their attorney and accountant's phone number.
Yeah.
Outside of the kids is something that is a no-brainer. You kind of, maybe it's not a no-brainer, but I would think of the kids, but I wouldn't think to get their contact of their accountant and attorney too, Could be very
Right.
helpful. Maybe even their doctor if they're really old.
Yeah. And we got to remember, if they are older and maybe this
Yeah.
mortgage only is in 5 years in, and you've
Yeah.
negotiated the deal where you get to keep it for the length of the underlying mortgage, that's another 25 years.
Yeah. Yeah.
It's likely those sellers are going to die.
Right.
And when they die, it's common, especially if they're still getting the mail from the bank, they may just call up the bank and say, hey, my dad died.
Yeah.
And he still has this loan. And then that's going to bring the bank in, right?
Yeah.
That you can work with the banks. And in the event of death, kind of FYI is most banks will allow like a family member to assume a loan.
Oh, got it.
With some extent, it's not really a loan assumption. They actually let heirs take over the property subject to is what they're really allowing.
Got it.
Because they know that maybe the wife, maybe the husband's wife is still living in the home, right?
Yeah.
But she's not on the loan. Her husband's dead, and so banks will work with you in death. But you've got to make sure that your sellers sort of know how to communicate with the bank. And just say, oh, yeah, we're going to keep the house,
Yes.
and we will make payments. And, most banks will be fine with that. And as long as they don't look at title, they'll never know.
Wonderful. Okay. Excellent. Jeff, outside of your class, because by the time a lot of people see this video, your class will have been done.
But
how
the class will be available digitized online at reimasteryou.com.
Wonderful. Wonderful. Great. So if they follow this video, want to get more educated in seller financing, just head over to reimasteryou.com. Is there like a special membership portal?
No, from the homepage, you'll see just the different drop downs on the different pages. You're just going to go to the REI Mastery U page, and it'll tell you all about our different programs, our online programs, our rookie investor program, our professional investor program, and all the mastery courses and how to get them.
Great. Excellent. And then, of course, if you need an amazing attorney, then
yep, I'm here too.
You could just call Jeff himself.
Yeah, that one, 801-560-2180. And if they need to get a hold of you, Yoshi, how are they going to do it?
Yeah, great question. 801-810-4475.
Perfect. And Yoshi is an awesome coach and mentor and buddy and friend, and he's so willing to help anybody on a deal. And yeah, he's awesome. So give Yoshi a call too.
I appreciate it. Thanks, Jeff.
Okay.
All right. Well, that is the end of this episode of Deals A to Z. And if you guys enjoyed it, don't forget to subscribe and check out our next episode. Thanks so much, Jeff.
Yep.